Welcome to Free Science Fiction Stories. Today's story is actually a collection of some of my sci-fi horror tales. I hope you enjoy today's video. Please like and subscribe for new stories. Thank you.
All alone in the dark. Michael Trent stood in the observation bay, his gloved hand pressed lightly against the reinforced glass. Beyond the viewport, the resupply ship's thrusters burned bright, casting fleeting shadows across the dimly lit bay. Its engines flared brighter, a stark reminder of the life he'd left behind, now shrinking into the void. He watched as it became little more than a pinprick of light against the star-flecked blackness. Then, nothing at all. Behind him, the lunar mining station hummed with an artificial rhythm, a mix of failing machinery and the low thrum of life support systems. The station's designers had tried to make the facility livable, even pleasant. Softly glowing panels, an assortment of fake plants tucked into sleek planters, and walls painted in neutral tones to mimic a sense of home. But all the fake greenery and warm light couldn't hide the oppressive stillness of the place. It was a sterile graveyard of human ingenuity, buried in one of the moon's eternal shadows. Michael exhaled, his breath fogging briefly against the cold glass. 3 months down, he muttered to himself. 3 more to go. The words rang hollow, lost in the silence of the bay. The mining station was never meant to feel like this. Decades earlier, it had been a hub of activity. Engineers, construction crews, and researchers had filled the halls, their voices bouncing off the walls in a cacophony of progress. But those days were gone. The wars had stripped Earth's infrastructure bare, and the catastrophic failure of the Spire, the orbital elevator meant to revolutionize space travel, had severed the tether between Earth and its celestial ambitions. Now, the station was a shadow of its former self, run by a skeleton crew. Officially, they were here to extract helium-3 and rare Earth elements, vital resources for rebuilding Earth's shattered technological infrastructure. Unofficially, Michael thought, they were here to keep the station from falling apart completely. He crossed the observation bay and entered the main corridor. The soft hiss of the automatic door made the emptiness feel even more pronounced. The lights flickered as he passed, a constant reminder of the facility's age and neglect. In the distance, he could hear the faint whir of automated mining equipment somewhere deep in the lunar regolith. The sound was familiar, almost comforting in its monotony. Almost. The station was vast, built to accommodate hundreds of workers at its peak, but now, with barely a dozen people spread across shifts, it felt like a hollow labyrinth. The echo of his footsteps bounced back at him as he made his way to the control room, the emptiness amplifying every sound until it felt like someone, or something, was following him. Michael settled into his seat at the console, staring at the flickering monitors that displayed endless streams of data. Oxygen levels stable, mining output consistent, radiation shields intact. The station was running as it always did, methodically, soullessly, and without pause. His mind wandered as he leaned back, his chair creaking in protest. The wars had changed everything. He remembered the stories of the Spire, how it was supposed to connect Earth to the heavens, eliminating the need for costly rocket launches. But when it was destroyed, everything unraveled. The rockets that were meant to supplement the Spire were gone too, their production halted, in anticipation of a world no longer dependent on them. Now, all that remained of humanity's presence on the moon were a few scattered mining stations, kept operational by dwindling crews like his. There had once been a colony on Mars, a grand experiment in interplanetary living, but it collapsed years ago. No one had heard from them since. Perhaps they were all dead, much like the future of space exploration itself. Michael's own past felt just as fractured. His family had been part of the migration to an O'Neill cylinder colony when he was a teenager, fleeing Earth's wars. He hadn't set foot on the planet since, nor did he expect to. The moon was his home now, or at least the closest thing to it. But space, as much as it had been a sanctuary, was lonelier than ever. The hours blended together in a haze of repetition. Michael followed the same routine every day, monitoring the machines that sucked helium-3 and rare earth elements from the lunar soil, fixing minor breakdowns, and recording the output in a log that no one would likely ever read. He would eat alone in the canteen, where the automated food dispensers offered tasteless, nutrient-dense meals that barely registered as sustenance. Then he would retreat to his cramped quarters, a small pod of artificial comfort that only magnified his sense of isolation. On rare occasions, he crossed paths with the other crew members. They were spread across different wings of the station, working staggered shifts to maximize efficiency. Conversations were short and perfunctory. "How's your section?" "Running smooth. Yours?" "Same." They all kept their heads down, trying to endure the monotony without losing themselves to it. The facility itself felt alive in ways that were unsettling. The walls groaned as if settling under the weight of lunar dust, and the vents whispered faintly in the silence. Sometimes, Michael thought he heard footsteps in the corridors when no one else should have been there. He would pause, heart pounding, and listen. But there was never anything, just the station, creaking and humming in its endless rhythm. During his rare breaks, Michael would return to the observation bay. It was the only place on the station that offered a view of something other than metal and machinery. Through the viewport, he could see the jagged lunar landscape stretching out to the horizon, its surface glittering faintly under the distant stars. In the far distance, Earth hung like a pale jewel, its light dimmed by the thick pane of reinforced glass. He would stare at it for minutes, sometimes hours, imagining what life was like down there now. Had it recovered? Was it worth fighting for anymore? But even the view couldn't quell the growing unease that gnawed at him. The station's silence felt heavier with each passing day. The fake plants, once meant to bring life to the sterile environment, now seemed like mockeries of the real thing. And the thought of spending another 3 months here, in this hollow shell of a once great endeavor, felt like a slow suffocation. As he returned to his duties, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that the station was watching him. The shadows in the corridors seemed to stretch a little too far, the flickering lights taking on an almost deliberate rhythm. He told himself it was just his mind playing tricks, a side effect of the isolation. But deep down, a part of him wondered if he was truly alone. Michael knelt beside the grinding mining rig, his gloved hands trembling slightly as he tightened a loose coupling. The air was heavy, stale despite the station's oxygen systems, and he could feel the sweat pooling at the base of his neck under his suit. The hum of machinery around him had taken on a strained, uneven tone, like a massive animal struggling to breathe. He glanced over his shoulder at the yawning dark beyond the rig, the shadows swallowing the edges of his floodlight. The tunnel, once filled with the steady rhythm of automated drills, was now unnervingly quiet. Every sound he made seemed amplified, bouncing off the jagged lunar walls in unnatural echoes. The systems were failing, faster than anyone had predicted. The mining rigs stalled for no apparent reason, their diagnostic panels flashing incomprehensible errors. Michael had already repaired this rig twice in the past week, but here it was again, sputtering to a halt. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, wrenching the coupling one last time. The lights flickered overhead, plunging the tunnel into momentary darkness. Michael froze, his breath caught in his throat. When the lights returned, the shadows seemed deeper, more menacing. He tapped his comm. "Rig 3 is back online, for now," he reported, his voice hollow in the silence. Back in the central hub, Michael removed his helmet, wiping a layer of grime and sweat from his face. He glanced at the air recycler's display. Oxygen levels had dipped again. It was the 3rd time this week. The recycler would sputter, alarms blaring, before correcting itself. Each time the team scrambled to fix it. But no one could pinpoint the issue. He entered the dimly lit control room, where Dr. Elena Vasquez hunched over a console, her sharp features illuminated by the sickly green glow of the monitors. The scientist barely looked up as he approached. "The recycler's glitching again," Michael said. Elena let out a frustrated sigh, rubbing her temples. I know. I've been trying to trace the fault, but the logs don't add up. They're missing timestamps, entire blocks of data just gone. She glanced at him, her eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. It's like something's erasing it. Michael frowned, the unease gnawing at him growing stronger. What about the AI? Has it flagged anything? Elena shook her head. Just corrupted streams, nothing actionable. It's like the system's blind spots are getting bigger. The lights flickered again, and a sharp crackle came from the overhead speakers. Michael and Elena exchanged a look as a faint, distorted sound whispered through the static before cutting off abruptly. It almost sounded like whistling. In the mess hall, Michael found Chief Engineer Carter seated at a table, his bulky frame hunched over a meal packet. The veteran engineer barely glanced up as Michael approached, his grizzled face set in a permanent scowl. "The recycler's acting up again," Michael said, sitting across from him. Carter grunted, stabbing at the unappetizing paste with his fork. "This place was held together with duct tape and prayers even before the wars," he muttered. "You're surprised things are breaking down?" Michael leaned forward, lowering his voice. "It's more than that. The malfunctions, the missing data. It feels deliberate." Carter snorted, finally looking up. "You've been out here too long, Trent. There's no grand conspiracy, just old equipment and bad luck. Do your job and stop jumping at shadows." Private Jensen entered the mess hall, his boots clanging louder than necessary against the metal floor. The young security officer carried himself with an air of bravado that didn't quite mask his nervousness. "Hey, Trent," Jensen said, nodding. "Heard you had trouble in the tunnels again." Michael glanced at him, noting the tension in his shoulders. "Yeah." The rig stalled, lights flickered, same old story. Jensen hesitated, then leaned in closer. "You think it's connected to what happened to Miller?" The question hung in the air like a noose. Miller had vanished during a shift change last week. No body, no explanation. "I don't know," Michael said finally, his voice tight. "But something's wrong here." The station's corridors felt narrower with each passing day, the walls closing in as if the facility itself was conspiring against them. The lights flickered more often now, leaving stretches of the station in eerie, impenetrable darkness. The AI's soothing voice, once a constant reassurance, now seemed ominous as it delivered garbled warnings about corrupted data streams and unauthorized access. Michael's hands trembled as he worked on a jammed conveyor belt in the processing bay. The machinery groaned, its gears grinding in protest. As he leaned closer, he froze. Deep gouges marred the metal surface, straight and even. They looked like blade marks, far too large to have been made by any tool. "Carter, you seeing this?" Michael called over the comm. "What now?" came Carter's gruff reply. Michael snapped a picture with his wrist mount scanner and sent it. "The belt's torn up. These marks don't look natural." There was a pause, then Carter's voice crackled back, annoyed. "Just replace the damn belt, Trent. I don't have time for ghost stories." Michael ground his teeth, swallowing his frustration. He couldn't shake the feeling that Carter was willfully ignoring the obvious, or perhaps he didn't want to see it. Later, as Michael walked back to the living quarters, he passed the sealed mining shaft where Miller had disappeared. He paused, staring at the heavy door. For a moment he thought he heard something faint beyond it. A soft, rhythmic sound, almost like breathing. Another incident shattered what little calm remained. The team gathered in the control room, Elena pacing as she played back the latest surveillance footage. The feed was corrupted, frames skipping and distorting, but one thing was clear. The mining rig had powered on by itself. No one had been near it, yet it moved as though guided. "This isn't a malfunction," Elena said, her voice trembling. "Something's tampering with the systems." Jensen shifted uncomfortably, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "You think it's sabotage?" Elena didn't answer, her eyes fixed on the screen. Michael stared at the footage, a sinking feeling twisting his stomach. "We need to shut it down," he said. "All of it. The rigs, the AI, everything." Carter scoffed. "And stop production? You'd like that, wouldn't you? Let Earth fall a little further behind because you're scared of some flickering lights? Michael rounded on him, his voice rising. This isn't about fear. Something's happening here, and if we don't figure it out, it's going to kill us. The tension was broken by a sudden noise, a loud metallic crash from the direction of the processing bay. The crew froze, their eyes darting to the door. Jensen drew his weapon, his bravado cracking. "Stay here," he said, moving toward the sound. Michael grabbed his arm. "Don't go alone." Jensen shook him off, forcing a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Relax, Trent. Probably just another loose panel." He stepped into the corridor, the shadows swallowing him whole. The remaining crew stood in silence, the oppressive weight of the station pressing down on them. The distant sound of Jensen's boots echoed, then stopped. And then the whistling began. Michael crouched beside the air filtration unit. His hands worked mechanically, tightening a stubborn valve while his mind churned with unease. The system had tripped another error, and this time the failure wasn't localized. The station's oxygen levels had dipped to dangerous lows before stabilizing, and the alarms had left his ears ringing. "Just a clog," he muttered to himself, his voice echoing in the empty maintenance bay. "Has to be a clog." But as he loosened the last bolt and pried open the filter casing, the breath caught in his throat. A viscous liquid pooled inside the unit, glowing faintly in the dim light. It oozed along the edges of the filter, dripping to the floor in thick, unnatural rivulets. Michael reached out with a gloved hand, hesitating as the substance pulsed faintly, almost as if alive. "What the hell?" he whispered, his words trailing off. The hiss of something skittering across metal sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He snapped his head around, scanning the shadows. A flicker of movement caught his eye. A small, spider-like creature darting into the darkness. Its legs were too long, its body unnervingly angular. It disappeared into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. Michael froze, his pulse hammering in his ears. His flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing nothing but empty ducts and the faint glow of the residue. The silence was deafening, the sense of being watched oppressive. He sealed the filter casing with trembling hands, his every instinct screaming at him to get out of the bay. The air was thick with tension as Michael hurried back to the central hub. The faint rhythmic hum of the station's systems no longer felt reassuring. It felt fragile, as though the entire facility could crumble at the slightest touch. The crew's faces mirrored his own anxiety, their interactions terse and fraught with suspicion. "We're not alone here," Michael said, breaking the uneasy silence as he entered the control room. Dr. Elena Vasquez looked up from her console, her eyes hollowed by sleepless nights. "What do you mean?" "There's things in the station. I saw something near the air recycler, and there was some kind of residue. It wasn't normal." Chief Engineer Carter leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "You're jumping at shadows again, Trent. This place has been falling apart for years. Weird noises, glitches, stuff like that. It's part of the job." Michael shook his head, his voice rising. "No, this isn't just the station breaking down. These things are tampering with the equipment. They're sabotaging us." Vasquez frowned, her hands tightening on the edge of the console. "Sabotaging? That doesn't make sense. Why would—" The lights flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness for several long seconds before stuttering back to life. A loud crash echoed from the mining drone bay, followed by the shrill, metallic screech of tearing metal. The crew froze, their gazes snapping toward the sound. "What was that? It wasn't another panel this time," Private Jensen whispered, his hand hovering over his sidearm. Michael met Vasquez's eyes. "We need to check it out." The mining drone bay was a war zone. One of the drones lay on its side, its frame twisted and gutted. Sparks arced from severed wires, casting erratic flashes across the bay. Blood smeared the floor in thick, jagged trails leading toward the shadows. Michael's gut twisted as his flashlight beam swept across a familiar figure. Dr. Vasquez lay crumpled near the drone, her lifeless eyes staring upward. Her torso had been cut open with flawless precision. Jensen's breath hitched and he started gagging. Michael forced himself to kneel beside her, his stomach churning. The residue he'd seen earlier coated the floor and the drone's mangled body. "They're studying us," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Carter's voice crackled over the comm, breaking the oppressive silence. "What's going on down there? You're supposed to be fixing things, not playing detectives." "She's dead, Carter," Michael snapped. "Vasquez is dead, and it wasn't an accident. Something's in here with us." The line went silent for a moment, then Carter's voice returned, colder. "Then you'd better figure out how to stop it." Isolation was no longer a state of mind, it was a tangible force that seeped into every corner of the facility, amplified by the dwindling crew. Michael wandered the dimly lit corridors, his footsteps the only sound aside from the occasional groan of stressed metal and the distant, melodic whistles of the unseen creatures. Carter had been the first to succumb to fear. His earlier bluster was a ruse. After an encounter with the alien intruders in the maintenance corridors, he had locked himself away in a supply room. "I'm safer here," he had muttered through the comms when Michael had tried to reason with him. "I'm not taking any chances." But when Michael returned later, there was only an eerie stillness. The door Carter had barricaded was now ajar, its locking mechanism disassembled. The room inside was in disarray, tools scattered, shelves overturned, the smell of ozone lingering in the air. On the floor, a bioluminescent trail shimmered faintly, leading out of the room and disappearing into the station's shadowy labyrinth of tunnels. Michael's stomach turned. He called out Carter's name, his voice echoing off the cold metal walls, but the response was only silence. Jensen hadn't lasted much longer. Panic had gripped him, and it showed in his desperate actions. Michael had passed him earlier in the week, struggling to erect a barricade from storage crates and scraps of metal. "They're everywhere," Jensen had shouted, his voice cracking. "We've got to keep them out." Michael had tried to calm him. "Jensen, that won't hold them. You've seen what they can do." But Jensen wouldn't listen. "Better than doing nothing," he snapped, his hands trembling as he wedged another crate into place. His eyes were wild, darting to every shadow, as though expecting the creatures to emerge at any second. When Michael returned to check on him later, the barricade had been obliterated. Crates and metal scraps lay scattered across the floor, splintered and twisted. The walls were painted with Jensen's blood, the stark crimson streaks contrasting against the cold gray panels. His weapon, a standard-issue rifle, lay nearby, its barrel mangled as if it had been bitten clean through. Michael's breath caught in his throat as he scanned the scene. There was no body, only smears leading into the darkness. The melodic whistles echoed faintly from the corridor ahead, growing softer as though the creatures were retreating, satisfied with their hunt. Michael's days blurred into nights, though time seemed meaningless in the station's perpetual artificial glow. Yet even that light felt oppressive now, its sterile brightness casting harsh shadows that seemed to shift and flicker at the edges of his vision. The creatures' attacks grew more coordinated, more deliberate, as if they were learning the station's layout and exploiting its vulnerabilities. The air recyclers faltered with increasing frequency, filling the station with a stale metallic tang before sputtering back to life. Electrical surges plunged sections of the facility into total darkness, and Michael had learned to fear those moments most of all. The shadows were no longer empty. They were alive with whispers, faint clicks, and the occasional brush of something unseen. The creatures moved with uncanny precision, targeting critical systems with surgical efficiency. They sabotaged the station's power grid, forcing Michael to reroute energy to keep the lights on. Without light, he knew the station would belong to them entirely. He worked frantically, but each repair felt like a temporary patch on a sinking ship. Michael wasn't sleeping anymore. He couldn't. The moment his eyes closed, he was haunted by visions of bioluminescent trails and the faces of his lost crewmates. He had tried barricading himself in the operations hub, but it was no use. The creatures always found a way in. Or worse, they didn't need to. Their presence felt omnipresent, a constant weight pressing down on him. He ate sparingly, his appetite eroded by stress and fear. The canteen, once a place of fleeting camaraderie, was now a hollow echo of what it had been. Plates of half-eaten rations lay abandoned on tables, left by crewmates who would never return. The fake plants that once added a touch of life to the station now seemed grotesque, their bright green plastic mocking his isolation. The only relief came when Michael wandered into the observation bay. From there he could see the moon's desolate surface stretching endlessly beneath the black void of space, and there, on the far horizon, hung Earth, a distant, unreachable sanctuary. He stared at it for hours, searching for solace in its faint blue glow. But the planet felt like a cruel joke. It was so close, yet impossibly far, a reminder of all he had lost. Michael's hands trembled as he pressed them against the cold glass of the viewport. His reflection stared back at him, pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken and rimmed with exhaustion. He didn't recognize himself anymore. A soft whistle broke the silence, low and melodic, carrying with it a sense of dreadful inevitability. It came from somewhere behind him. Michael turned slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. The corridor beyond the observation bay was shrouded in shadow, the light flickering as if on the verge of failing. "Not again," he whispered to himself, gripping his plasma cutter tightly. The hum of the blade filled the room, but it did little to dispel the growing darkness. Determined to fight back, Michael poured his remaining energy into repairing the comm system. They were the first thing to go down after his first sighting, and he had been so busy dealing with restoring power and air he hadn't had time. The console sparked and sputtered as he bypassed the corrupted circuits, his hands shaking from exhaustion. The creature's presence loomed just beyond the edge of the light, their faint, rhythmic whistling an ever-present reminder of the danger. "Come on," he muttered, his voice hoarse. Just work." Finally, the screen flickered to life and he frantically keyed in a distress signal. His voice cracked as he spoke into the mic. "This is Michael Trent, Lunar Mining Station Theta 4. We're under attack. Multiple crew members are down. Requesting immediate evacuation and reinforcements." The static-filled reply came after an agonizing wait. "Theta 4, this is Earth Control. Your distress signal has been received. Stand by. Transport en route. ETA approximately 72 hours. Michael sank into the chair, relief mingled with dread. 72 hours. It felt like an eternity. He glanced around the dimly lit control room, the shadows seeming to press closer with every passing moment. "You just have to survive," he whispered to himself, gripping his weapon tightly. "Just hold on." The air in the observation bay was stale, but Michael Trent barely noticed. He leaned against the viewport, his breath fogging the glass as he stared at the distant shape gliding toward the station. The transport ship was small, its engines casting a pale blue glow across the barren lunar surface. For the first time in weeks, a flicker of hope stirred in his chest, a fragile ember against the oppressive void. He allowed himself a moment of reprieve, pressing his forehead against the cool glass. The ship's outline grew clearer, its hull sleek and functional, a stark contrast to the decaying mining station around him. He could almost imagine the voices of the rescue crew, the sound of boots on metal floors, and the relief of human contact. "You made it," he whispered, his voice cracking. But the moment of solace shattered as a movement on the edge of the viewport caught his eye. A shadow flickered across the ship's hull, followed by another. Michael squinted, his stomach tightening as the faint, rhythmic whistle echoed faintly through the station, a sound he had come to dread. The transport ship slowed as it prepared to dock, its engines flaring briefly before stabilizing. But what Michael saw next made his blood run cold. A swarm of alien creatures poured from the dark craters surrounding the station, their black forms glinting in the harsh light of the colony's lights. They moved with terrifying speed, their elongated limbs propelling them across the barren landscape like spiders scuttling toward prey. They climbed the ship with their claws raking across the metal hull. Michael's heart pounded as he watched one creature latch onto the docking clamp, its spindly legs spreading wide to tear at the reinforced structure. Sparks erupted as the clamp groaned under the assault. "No," he muttered, his voice trembling. He slammed his fist against the comm panel, his voice a desperate shout. "Transport crew, do you copy? You're under attack. Get out of there!" The comm line crackled, a garbled response cutting through the static. "We see movement, too many of them." The voice cut off, replaced by the deafening sound of tearing metal. The aliens attacked with a ferocity Michael had never seen. Their claws ripped through the ship's outer hull as if it were paper, exposing its fragile interior to the vacuum. A violent explosion lit up the lunar surface as one of the engines was breached, sending debris hurtling in all directions. The viewport vibrated with the shockwave, and Michael stumbled back, his ears ringing. He watched in horror as the ship listed to one side, its stabilizers failing. The swarm continued its assault, prying open airlocks and venting the crew into the cold void of space. Tiny figures in EVA suits were flung outward, their lifeless bodies spinning away into the black. "God help us," Michael whispered, his legs threatening to give out beneath him. The ship's engines roared in a final desperate attempt to break free, but the damage was too severe. Flames burst from the remaining thrusters and the entire vessel began to disintegrate. A massive explosion followed, the blast illuminating the crater like a second sunrise. The shock waves slammed into the station, rattling the walls before the observation bay was plunged into darkness. Emergency lights flickered to life, casting the corridors in a sickly red glow. Alarms blared, their shrill tones echoing through the station's empty halls. Michael stumbled to his feet, his breath coming in short gasps. His ears rang from the explosion, and his head throbbed with the realization that his last hope of escape had been obliterated. The faint whistle returned, more insistent now, weaving through the cacophony like a haunting melody. Michael's heart sank as he realized the aliens weren't done. He grabbed a flashlight and bolted toward the operations hub, his boots pounding against the metal floor. The station felt different now, alive with the sounds of chittering claws and the metallic screech of the swarm tearing through the remaining barriers. As he rounded a corner, he froze. A section of the corridor ahead was warped and blackened from the explosion, the floor littered with twisted metal and shattered glass. Among the wreckage, the first of the creatures emerged, hunched and angular, its many eyes fixed on him. Behind it, more skittered into view, their movements unnervingly synchronized. Michael backed away slowly, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The beam of light caught the sheen of their exoskeletons, and he saw the sharp, jagged appendages that gleamed like knives. They didn't move immediately, almost as if studying him, their heads tilting in unison. The silence shattered as they charged. Michael sprinted down the corridor, his lungs burning as the creatures closed in behind him. The sound of their claws scraping against metal was deafening, an ever-present reminder of their speed. He reached the operations hub and slammed his hand against the access panel, the door hissing open just as one of the creatures lunged. He threw himself inside and hit the override, the door slamming shut with a metallic clang. The impact reverberated as the creatures struck the other side, their claws screeching against the metal. Michael collapsed against the wall, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. The hub was dimly lit, its screens flickering with static. The faint sound of the creature's whistles seeped through the walls, letting him know he was far from safe. Michael forced himself to his feet and surveyed the room, his mind racing. The comm system was still operational, but for how long? He approached the console, his fingers shaking as he keyed in commands. The camera feeds showed the swarm moving through the station, their movements methodical and purposeful. They weren't just attacking, they were dismantling the station. Every nut and bolt was being undone. Michael swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. "You're trapped." He stared at the static-filled monitor, the realization sinking in. There was no rescue coming, no way out. The station was no longer his sanctuary, it was their hive. Michael crouched in the dimly lit maintenance bay, his hands trembling as he tightened the bolts on his makeshift weapon. A cutting torch scavenged from the mining rig sputtered to life, casting eerie, flickering light across the confined space. Beside him lay a jagged metal pole, a piece of scrap he had sharpened into a crude spear. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. The walls around him groaned, the station's decaying infrastructure reminding him of its frailty. Somewhere beyond the bulkheads, the aliens prowled, their melodic whistles drifting through the corridors like ghostly songs. Each note was a taunt, a reminder that they were closing in. He glanced at the small array of tools and makeshift barricades he had assembled. The mining station was never meant to withstand a siege, and he wasn't a soldier, but survival left no room for hesitation. The sound of claws on metal shattered the oppressive quiet, snapping Michael to attention. The whistling grew louder, more insistent. He extinguished the torch, plunging the room into near darkness, and pressed his back against the wall, gripping the spear so tightly his knuckles ached. The first creature appeared at the edge of the bay. Its elongated limbs twitched, its dark eyes scanning the room. Behind it, more shadows shifted, too many for Michael to count. He waited, heart hammering, until the lead alien stepped closer. With a guttural yell, he lunged, driving the sharpened pole into the creature's head. It let out a mournful whistle, its glowing blood spraying in a grotesque arc. Michael yanked the spear free, but the alien didn't collapse. It staggered, adjusting its stance, its gaze locking onto him with a terrifying intelligence. "Oh no," Michael muttered under his breath. The swarm moved in unison, flanking him. Michael hurled a makeshift grenade, an old coolant canister rigged with an explosive charge. The blast sent shrapnel and freezing mists through the room, temporarily scattering the aliens. He didn't wait to see the aftermath. He sprinted through a side hatch, his boots pounding against the metal floor. The corridors were a maze, twisting and turning in endless loops. Emergency lights flickered erratically, plunging sections into pitch blackness. Michael stumbled through the station, his breath ragged and his mind racing. The creatures were everywhere, their whistles echoing through the metal halls. He found brief refuge in a supply closet, slamming the door shut and jamming it with a steel pipe. The space was claustrophobic, the air thick with the smell of old machinery. As he sat in the dark, he could hear them outside, scraping, sniffing, learning. Michael glanced at his bloodied hands, the calluses and burns from weeks of maintenance work. This was supposed to be his safe place, a haven where he could contribute to humanity's recovery. Now, it was a tomb. He eventually made his way to the observation bay, the one place where he felt he could breathe, even if only for a moment. The massive viewport revealed the barren lunar surface, its jagged craters illuminated by Earth's distant glow. The sight had always brought him some solace, a reminder that something like a home was still out there, even if it felt impossibly far away. But now, the view was a bitter mockery. Earth's blue light had always seemed faint, unreachable, like a fading memory. Michael slumped against the glass, exhaustion pulling at his limbs. His reflection stared back at him. Hollow eyes, a face smeared with blood and grime, a man on the edge of breaking. "This was supposed to be the future," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "The moon, Mars, the stars. We were going to rebuild. We were supposed to escape everything that went wrong down there." He thought of the Mars colony, of the silence that had followed its collapse. No rescue missions, no communication. The people there were just gone. Maybe space wasn't humanity's salvation. Maybe it was its final, inevitable graveyard. The whistle came again, piercing and sharp. Michael's head snapped up. The aliens had found him. He scrambled to his feet, grabbing the cutting torch and his remaining grenades. This was it, the final stand. There was nowhere left to run. The door burst open, and the creatures flooded in, their bioluminescent bodies casting grotesque shadows on the walls. Michael ignited the torch, its flame roaring to life. He swung it wildly, the heat forcing the aliens back momentarily. The grenades followed, each explosion tearing through the swarm but doing little to slow their relentless advance. One of the creatures lunged, its claws slashing at his shoulder. Pain exploded through his body as he fell to the ground, the torch clattering out of reach. The alien loomed over him, its multifaceted eyes reflecting his terrified expression. He grabbed a shard of broken glass from the floor and drove it into the creature's neck. It thrashed, its blood spraying his face, but he didn't stop. He stabbed again and again until it collapsed on top of him. Gasping for air, Michael shoved the body aside and staggered to his feet. The remaining aliens circled him, their whistles rising in pitch, filling the room with a cacophony that made his ears ring. He clutched his side, blood seeping through his fingers. This is how it ends, he thought, staring down the swarm. Alone, cornered, and utterly insignificant in the face of something so vast and relentless. As the creatures closed in, Michael felt the weight of his isolation more acutely than ever. There would be no rescue, no last-minute salvation. The moon, the stars, space itself, they were never humanity's refuge. They were the void, cold and uncaring, and he was just another piece of debris lost within it. With a deep breath, he tightened his grip on the torch and the broken shard. If this was where it ended, he'd make sure they remembered him. The light from Earth dimmed behind him as the swarm surged forward. The observation bay was silent, save for Michael's ragged breathing. The air was thick with the acrid scent of charred metal and scorched flesh, a nauseating reminder of his desperation. His plasma cutter hissed faintly, its blade flickering with unstable energy. In his other hand, he clutched the makeshift flamethrower, little more than a modified fuel canister with a crude ignition system. It was crude, volatile, and unreliable, much like his chances of survival. The door to the bay shuddered as the aliens clawed at it from the other side. Their melodic whistles reverberated through the metal, rising in an eerie crescendo that seemed to mock his every effort. Michael leaned heavily against the console, blood dripping from the gashes in his side. His vision blurred, but he forced himself to focus on the screen in front of him. "This is Michael Trent," he began, his voice hoarse and trembling. "Mining station Theta 4 has been compromised. Hostile alien presence confirmed. Do not, I repeat, do not send reinforcements." His fingers hovered over the console's keyboard, inputting the station's self-destruct sequence. It wouldn't destroy the entire site, but it would render the facility useless. He pressed the final key and looked up, his eyes scanning the viewport. The moon's barren surface stretched out before him, a lifeless expanse of shadows and craters. Beyond it, Earth hung in the black void like a distant beacon, its blue glow a cruel reminder of what he could never return to. "Burn it from orbit," he said into the recorder, his voice steadier now, resigned. "End it here." The reinforced door to the observation bay finally gave way with a deafening screech, the metal bending and snapping under the relentless assault. The aliens poured in, their bioluminescent bodies casting an eerie green glow that danced across the walls. Their eyes shimmered with an unnatural intelligence, and their claws scraped against the floor with a rhythmic, deliberate cadence. Michael turned to face them, his back to the viewport. He ignited the flamethrower with a sharp hiss, the flames roaring to life and bathing the room in flickering light. The nearest creatures recoiled, their high-pitched whistles turning into guttural screeches. He advanced on them, the flames licking at their elongated limbs, forcing them back momentarily. But they didn't retreat for long. The swarm regrouped, circling him, their movements calculated and deliberate. They weren't just attacking, they were testing him, probing for weaknesses. Michael swung the plasma cutter in a wide arc, slicing through the nearest creature. Its glowing blood sprayed across the floor, hissing as it evaporated on contact with the flames. The flamethrower sputtered, its fuel reserves dangerously low. Michael staggered back toward the console, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. His breaths came in short, sharp gasps, and his vision tunneled. He was running on pure adrenaline now, his survival instincts warring with the crushing weight of inevitability. One of the larger aliens lunged at him, its claws slicing through the air with terrifying speed. Michael raised the plasma cutter, driving it into the creature's chest. It let out a guttural scream, thrashing violently before collapsing at his feet. But there were more. Too many more. The flamethrower finally gave out with a pitiful hiss, leaving him with nothing but the plasma cutter and his resolve. The creatures surged forward, their dark forms filling the room like a tide. Michael swung wildly, his strikes growing weaker with each pass. As the swarm closed in, Michael stumbled back against the viewport, the cold glass pressing against his back. His legs buckled and he sank to the floor, the plasma cutter slipping from his grasp. The aliens surrounded him, their whistles blending into a haunting, melodic dirge. Michael lifted his head, his gaze fixed on Earth. It shimmered faintly on the horizon, so small and fragile against the infinite expanse of space. He thought of his family, of the O'Neill cylinder colony where he'd grown up. The lights in the observation bay flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. Only the faint glow of Earth and the bioluminescent aliens remained. Michael closed his eyes, his final thoughts a silent prayer that his message would be heeded, that no one else would share his fate. The last thing he heard was the sound of glass cracking under the weight of the swarm. The mining station fell silent, its corridors dark and lifeless. Outside, the moon's surface stretched on in endless shadow, untouched and indifferent. Earth hung above, distant and unreachable, a fading dream of salvation. And within the station, the observation bay stood empty save for the faint glimmer of bioluminescent residue and the broken remnants of Michael Trent's last stand. Top of the world. Gavin adjusted his harness, a difficult thing to do with all his safety gear. He was practically in a spacesuit with all of the layers and supplemental oxygen he was required to take with him. It was cold even at the relatively low altitude of the spine's lower depths. His breath fogged his faceplate as he prepared to ascend and stepped into the cage of the elevator. The yellow climber module hummed faintly, its motors straining against the wind that lashed at the spine. The corporation had briefed him that morning with the usual clipped indifference. Structural anomalies, bad sensor data, and of course, the implicit expectation of results. "The drones are giving inconsistent readings," his supervisor had said, her voice crackling over the comm. "We need you to recalibrate or replace the faulty units. Keep the costs down." Yeah, sure, costs. She hadn't mentioned previous attempts by other teams. Gavin had to dig through archived logs to piece together the truth. 3 crews had been sent to this section in the past 6 months. None had completed their work. The official explanations ranged from equipment failure to operator error, but the reports were sparse, sanitized, and filled with gaps. He didn't ask questions. That would be pointless. He'd learned long ago that curiosity in this line of work rarely led to answers, only more danger. The module shuddered as it continued its ascent, carrying Gavin past the lower tiers where scavengers and squatters eked out a living in the rusted bones of the elevator's superstructure. As the little platform climbed higher, the city below dissolved into a hazy blur, and the wind grew colder, sharper, cutting through his insulated suit. At first the ascent was routine. The spine creaked and groaned around him, a sound Gavin was used to, but as he climbed farther into the abandoned sections, the noise took on an almost rhythmic quality, like metal sighing under an invisible weight. Aside from the repair crews who had preceded him, this section of the spire had been abandoned for years. There was the token effort to restore and finish the elevator, but everyone assumed that was a lost cause. He thought so too. As he approached the area in question, his HUD displayed the sensor anomalies, irregular readings scattered across the structural nodes. Most of the sensors were inoperable, likely damaged by wind shear or debris, but the data they'd sent before going offline didn't make sense. Fluctuations in the structure's integrity and unexplained energy readings. He tightened his grip on the module's railing, his eyes scanning the beams around him. At this altitude, the spine felt less like a structure and more like a cage, its latticework of steel girders crisscrossing overhead in an endless maze. A glint of metal caught his eye as the module slowed near one of the maintenance platforms. He stopped the module to investigate. Gavin stepped off cautiously, his boots clanging against the gridded floor. The wind howled through the beams, a hollow, mournful sound. On the platform he found a toolbox, its contents scattered as if someone had left in a hurry. A wrench lay near the edge, its surface rusted, but not from years of neglect. A safety harness dangled from a beam, swaying gently in the wind, its tether severed cleanly, the edges of the cut unnervingly smooth. Gavin crouched to examine it, running his gloved fingers along the frayed edge. "Not wind shear," he muttered, his voice muffled by his helmet. Farther up the beam he noticed scratches, long parallel marks etched into the metal, as if something with sharp edges had dragged itself along the surface. He straightened, a chill crawling up his spine. The logs hadn't mentioned anything like this. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. It was probably nothing, equipment falling or scavengers trying to strip the platform for parts. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As he reboarded the climber module, the wind shifted, carrying with it a faint sound. It was high-pitched, a single whistle that seemed to linger in the air. Gavin paused, his hand hovering over the control panel. The sound stopped, leaving only the groan of the structure and the howl of the wind. He shook his head and pressed the ascent button, the module jolting upward. But the whistle followed, faint and intermittent, like a distant call. It wasn't the wind. It couldn't be the wind. The anomaly zone loomed above Gavin, a labyrinth of girders, cables, and half-finished maintenance platforms silhouetted against the thin gray light. The wind screamed around him now, more intense than at lower altitudes, and carried with it a strange sense of desolation. This part of the spine had been abandoned for years, but the stark silence felt unnatural, as though even time itself had stopped. Gavin docked his climber module to a rusted platform near the center of the anomaly zone. The sound echoed faintly, swallowed almost immediately by the vastness of the structure. His HUD flickered, displaying the anomaly zone's boundaries, a cluster of sensors that had gone dark weeks ago. The drone sent to investigate had stopped transmitting shortly after arrival, and other teams had failed. Now it was his job to figure out why. The first drone came into view as Gavin stepped cautiously onto the platform. The device lay against a beam, its outer casing opened with precise surgical cuts. Components were scattered across the floor, as though methodically removed and placed according to some criteria he didn't understand. The drone's internal wiring had been extracted in clean, coiled bundles, and its camera lenses dangled from their sockets like empty eyes. Gavin crouched beside it, his gloved fingers tracing the edges of the cuts. They were too smooth, too perfect to be caused by debris or wind shear. He muttered into his comm, "This isn't normal wear. Something took it apart." There were more drones as he moved farther into the zone, each one disassembled with an unsettling level of precision. The further Gavin ventured, the more signs of abandonment he found. A discarded helmet lay wedged between two beams, its faceplate cracked and smeared with what looked like blood. Nearby, a set of safety lines dangled from the structure, their ends severed cleanly, just like the drone casings. Half-completed repairs littered the platform, tools left mid-task, cables coiled but not secured. Gavin picked up a wrench, its handle smeared with grime and something darker, and set it down quickly, his pulse quickening. "Where did they go?" he murmured, scanning the area. His HUD pinged faint movement signatures ahead, but the signals were erratic, distorted by the high-altitude wind. Every time he turned toward the readings, they disappeared, flickering like ghosts in the periphery. He attached his safety tether, deciding to examine this area further. With his toolkit in one hand, he proceeded. As he reached the edge of the platform, the whistling began. At first it was soft, barely audible over the wind, a single high-pitched note that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Gavin froze, his ears straining to locate the source. The sound wove through the beams like a melody, rising and falling in eerie, deliberate tones. "It's just the wind," he told himself, but the words felt hollow. The whistle grew louder, more rhythmic, and Gavin realized it wasn't random, it was a pattern. The beams around him began to groan under the force of the wind, but the whistling cut through the noise, sharp and clear. His breathing quickened as his HUD flickered again, registering something moving toward him. The signature was faint, just a blip, but it was enough to send a chill down his spine. Gavin spotted the severed support cable just ahead. The thick wire hung limp, its end glinting in the light. He stepped closer, his pulse pounding as he examined the cut. It was identical to the ones on the drones, smooth, precise, as though made by a machine far more advanced than anything he'd ever seen. A shadow moved. He spun to face it, his heart leaping into his throat, but saw nothing. The wind screamed louder, and the whistling rose to a crescendo, echoing through the beams like a haunting chorus. Then it appeared. The thing moved with an unnatural fluidity, its shiny black shell reflecting the flickering lights. Its triangular head tilted toward Gavin, the many-fingered limbs twitching rhythmically. Scalpel-like appendages clicked against the metal as it advanced, the melodic whistling now clearly emanating from its sleek form. Gavin stumbled backward, his breath hitching. "What the?" he managed to whisper before the creature lunged. It sliced cleanly through his safety line, and even though he wasn't near the edge, he suddenly felt like he was about to fall. His one safety measure had been removed effortlessly. His boots skidded across the grid as he grabbed onto a nearby beam with one hand, the sharp metal digging into his gloves. The whistling thing followed, its movements eerily calculated, its head tilting as if studying him. Adrenaline surged as Gavin swung his toolkit, the heavy case striking the creature's leg with a metallic clang. It reeled for a moment but recovered quickly, advancing again with terrifying speed. Gavin scrambled toward another section of the platform. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his HUD flashed red with warning signs. Safety compromised. Structural instability detected. At least this particular section had active sensors. The monster didn't relent, its melodic whistle weaving through the air as it pursued him. Gavin vaulted over a gap in the platform, landing hard on the other side. The creature hesitated, its head tilting again before it began to retreat into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. The whistling faded, but Gavin's heart continued to pound. He leaned against the beam, his hands shaking as he scanned the darkness for any sign of movement. Whatever had dismantled the drones and killed the repair teams wasn't human. The spine groaned like a wounded beast as Gavin clung to the nearest beam, his breath jagged in the thin, high-altitude air. The severed safety line dangled uselessly behind him, swaying in the wind like a grim taunt. His climber module could be seen a ways off, its motors fried, probably the work of this creature. He was stranded, his connection to the safety of the lower levels now irreparably broken. His HUD flickered erratically, its warnings cascading in a crimson overlay. Safety line compromised. Climber module offline. Structural instability detected. Gavin took a deep breath, willing his trembling hands to steady. The whistling had stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. It was the kind of silence that stretched too thin, pregnant with the promise of something unseen waiting in the shadows. He had to move. Gavin gripped his toolkit tighter, scanning the maze of beams and platforms for the next viable route. The spine stretched endlessly upward and downward, a skeletal labyrinth against the pale sky. His only option was to climb higher, toward the anomaly zone's central sensor hub. If he could reach it, maybe he could trigger an emergency beacon. And there should be another climber module. But the damage in this area was significant. a perilous journey on its own without that thing stalking him. As he stepped onto a precarious crossbeam, the whistling started again. Faint at first, like a distant melody carried on the wind, then louder, closer, and from multiple directions. So many. His heart raced as he twisted his head, scanning the latticework of steel girders. His HUD picked up faint motion signatures, but they disappeared as quickly as they appeared, ghostly blips on the edge of perception. Gavin whispered to himself, "They're hunting me." A metallic clang reverberated nearby, followed by the unmistakable whistling. Gavin broke into a sprint, the beam swaying beneath him as he crossed to the next platform. The sound of pursuit grew louder, accompanied by the haunting, melodic whistles that seemed to harmonize with each other. He dared not look back. Reaching a dilapidated junction box, Gavin dropped to his knees and ripped it open with a multi-tool. The wires inside were frayed, coated in frost and corrosion, but there was enough juice left in the system for his plan. His hands worked quickly, splicing cables and rerouting power to the nearest structural girders. The whistling was so close now that it seemed to vibrate through his chest. He glanced over his shoulder and saw two of them, their triangular heads tilted in unison, their scalpel limbs slicing through the air as they crawled across the beams toward him. "Come on," Gavin hissed, connecting the final wire. Sparks danced along the metal as the girders lit up with a low, crackling hum. One of the whistlers lunged, and Gavin threw the switch. The creature spasmed violently before collapsing, twitching as arcs of electricity coursed through its body. The second whistler hesitated, its head cocking in that eerie, studying manner. Then it darted to the side, vanishing into the shadows. Gavin cursed under his breath. They learned fast. The wind howled louder as Gavin pressed onward, the structure beneath him trembling with every gust. He climbed higher, his gloves slipping against frost-coated beams, his oxygen supply steadily depleting. His breathing was labored despite the supplemental oxygen, and dizziness clawed at the edges of his vision. The HUD displayed warnings of hypoxia, but he ignored them. Every step felt like a gamble. The beams were riddled with surgical cuts, some so deep that entire sections of the structure sagged dangerously. The whistlers weren't just predators, they were dismantling the spine with methodical precision. Gavin paused to inspect one of the cuts. It was so clean, so deliberate, that it might have been made with a laser. A sudden gust of wind nearly knocked him off balance, and he clung to a beam, his pulse hammering in his ears, the world wheeling beneath his feet. The whistling began again, this time above him. Gavin craned his neck to see a whistler perched on a higher platform, its glowing blood dripping from a previous injury. Must be the one he hit with the tool case. It stared down at him, unmoving, as if daring him to continue. The image of the disassembled drones flashed through Gavin's mind, their parts scattered like bones on a battlefield. He remembered the briefing, the corporate reps' clipped assurances that the anomaly zone was safe, that the previous failures were due to human error. Human error, Gavin muttered bitterly. They had known something was up here. The missing teams, the faulty sensors, the gaps in the logs, it all pointed to something the corporation didn't want to acknowledge. And now, he was paying the price for their lies. His mind drifted to the crews who had come before him. Had they heard the same whistles, seen the same glimmers of black shapes darting through the beams? Had they fought like him to survive in this hellscape, only to vanish without a trace? A loud clang snapped him back to the present. Another monster emerged from the shadows, its scalpel limbs clicking as it approached cautiously. Gavin backed away, his mind racing. The electrified beams had bought him time, but the creatures were learning. He needed another plan. And fast. He reached a junction where several beams converged, forming a small platform. With shaking hands, he rummaged through his toolkit, pulling out a flare gun. It wasn't meant for combat, but it was all he had. The beast crept closer, its triangular head tilting as it studied him. The melodic whistling was deafening now, echoing through the structure like a symphony of dread. Gavin aimed the flare gun and fired. The flare struck the creature's shell, exploding in a burst of light and heat. The monster toppled off the beam, disappearing into the abyss below. But there was no time to celebrate. The remaining enemies, undeterred, began to close in from all sides. Gavin fired another flare, forcing them to retreat momentarily, but his supply was limited. His HUD flashed a warning: ammunition depleted. His vision blurred as fatigue and oxygen deprivation took hold. He clung to the beam, his hands sore. The whistling rose again, a chilling crescendo that seemed to mock his struggle. Gavin gritted his teeth, trying to come up with a solution. He wasn't going to die here, not like this, not for them. He crouched low on a precarious beam, inching his way past a damaged section. His breath came in shallow gasps, each step sending tremors through the unstable structure. Below, the vast city stretched into a dim haze, punctuated by the occasional glint of sunlight reflecting off broken glass. Then, the beam beneath him groaned. It was a sound that rippled through the spine, a deep, resonant warning. Gavin froze, his hands gripping the steel as he felt the vibrations intensify. "No," he muttered, shifting his weight carefully. But it was too late. With a deafening crack, the weakened section gave way, and Gavin scrambled for purchase as the beam collapsed. The chain reaction was immediate and catastrophic. Girders and support cables snapped, tumbling in a cacophony of screeching metal. Huge chunks of debris plummeted down, disappearing into the haze like falling stars. Gavin held onto the only secured beam he could reach. The noise was deafening. The whistling returned, sharper and louder than before. It echoed through the collapsing structure, no longer a solitary melody but a symphony of overlapping tones. Gavin ran toward the last intact climber module. The structure around him groaned under the strain of the damage it had sustained, the collapse continuing to spread like a living thing. He ran toward the center of the structure, and the peripheral section fell away. A shadow flickered in the corner of his vision. He turned just in time to see one lunging at him from above. Its scalpel limbs slashed through the air, forcing him to dodge. He swung wildly with his toolkit, striking the creature. The whistler recoiled, its bioluminescent blood dripping onto the platform. But it wasn't finished. The creature lunged again, its whistle rising to a piercing crescendo. Gavin braced himself, then swung the case again. The already off-balance creature fell, its limbs flailing as it toppled over the edge, disappearing into the void below. Shaking, Gavin hauled himself onto the climber module at last. He hit the button and the motors whirred to life, and the platform began its descent, the collapsing spine fading into the distance. He slumped against the railing, his body trembling from pain and exhaustion. As the climber module neared the lower levels, Gavin's comms crackled back to life. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. His supervisor's voice came through, cold and detached. "Gavin, we've received reports of structural damage in the anomaly zone. Can you confirm?" He clenched his teeth, his hands tightening into fists. "Confirm?" The whole section collapsed. "I barely made it out alive." The voice cut him off. "We've reviewed your bio readings. Signs of disorientation and erratic behavior suggest high-altitude sickness." Gavin stared at the comm panel, disbelief giving way to fury. "Hallucinations? I've got footage. We'll debrief you upon your return. This conversation is over." The line went dead. Gavin slammed his fist into the console, the pain sharp but grounding. He was alive, but the corporation was already spinning the narrative, blaming him for the collapse. Back on the ground and with no time to recover, Gavin limped into the debriefing room, his suit still streaked with bioluminescent residue. He laid out his footage he'd collected, his voice shaking with anger as he recounted the events. But the corporate representatives barely looked at him. "The collapse was caused by structural failure," one of them said, their tone dismissive. "Your claims of Hostile entities are noted but unsubstantiated. You're ignoring the evidence, Gavin snapped, slamming his fist on the table. Those things are out there, dismantling the spine piece by piece. You're sending people to their deaths. One representative folded her hands, her expression blank. This meeting is over. Please leave your equipment for analysis. Hours later, Gavin sat in a makeshift barracks. The cuts on his suit, the footage on his HUD, they told the truth, even if no one else would believe it. The corporation might ignore the threat, but Gavin couldn't. As he gazed at the towering ruins of the spine through the barracks window, he resolved to find a way out of this line of work. But deep down, he knew the spine, and whatever lurked within it, would haunt him forever. Wirework. The city was a husk now. He remembered a time before, when he helped build it. A long time ago now. Broken towers of steel and glass stretched like jagged ribs from the carcass. The once promising landscape turned into an almost unnavigable disaster. In the distance, the orbital elevator, a miracle of engineering, loomed, a white monolith disappearing into the heavens. Once a thin lifeline to space, it now stood as a grim reminder of better days. Mac crouched in the shadows of a ruined street, his hands deftly working to pry a bundle of copper wires from a crumbling junction box. The tang of rust and mildew filled the air. His gloves, worn and thin, barely shielded him from the sharp edges of corroded metal. He paused, wiping sweat from his forehead, the sticky grit of the city's dust clinging to his skin. The wires, when finally freed, gleamed dully in the faint light. But something caught his eye, a strand cut cleanly, as though sliced with surgical precision. Mac frowned, holding the severed end closer. No jagged edges, no fraying insulation. This was no scavenger's work. He ran his thumb over the cut. Too clean, he muttered. The last time he'd seen cuts like these was years ago, back when he still wore a contractor's badge and ran diagnostics on freshly installed systems. Whoever had been here wasn't using makeshift tools or brute force. This was corporate-grade work, or something else. A shiver ran through him, though the air was warm and still. He scanned the ruins around him, feeling exposed. It wasn't unusual for scavengers to run into each other, and such encounters rarely ended well. But this felt different. The faint metallic taste of adrenaline bloomed in his mouth as he stashed the wires in his bag. Time to find quieter pickings, he said to himself, heading toward a part of the city he'd saved for emergencies. A place he knew others wouldn't go. The underground zone was quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed against his eardrums and amplified his own breathing. Max squeezed through a rusted maintenance hatch, his flashlight beam slicing through the dark. The tunnels smelled faintly of ozone and damp concrete, a scent that dredged up memories of better days. He worked methodically, stripping wires and unscrewing industrial capacitors. Each satisfying clink of metal added to his haul. This area had been untouched for years. He smiled to himself, the first glimmer of optimism he'd felt in days. Then he heard it. A faint, high-pitched whistle, soft and distant, but unnervingly deliberate. Mac froze, his hand still gripping a thick cable. The whistle came again, louder this time, echoing through the tunnels in irregular bursts. It wasn't wind. Wind didn't whistle with such intent. The pitch changes too abrupt, like a musical instrument, but one he'd never heard before. His flashlight flickered, casting shadows that seemed to writhe in the corners of his vision. Mac cursed under his breath, shaking the light until it steadied. The whistle stopped. The silence returned, heavier now, as if the tunnels themselves were holding their breath. Mac's fingers tightened around his tools. His instincts screamed at him to leave, but curiosity rooted him in place. He swept the beam of his flashlight down the tunnel and froze. Something moved. A flash of glossy black, like polished obsidian, slid into the edge of his vision. It was fast, too fast to follow. Mac's pulse hammered in his ears. He took a step back, his boots scraping against the concrete. The whistle resumed, closer now, and more melodic, as if mocking his fear. He turned and ran. The tunnels twisted and turned, a maze of decaying infrastructure. Mac's every step sent echoes bouncing off the walls, a cacophony that seemed to follow him. The whistling grew louder, weaving into a discordant symphony. He didn't dare look back. His lungs burned as he climbed a ladder and burst into the open air. The city felt no safer, but at least here he had his traps. Mac's safe house wasn't much, just a fortified husk of a building surrounded by booby traps. Wires snaked from capacitors to hidden tripwires and electrified barriers, all cobbled together from his days as an electrician. They weren't pretty, but they worked. He slammed the reinforced door shut and threw the bolts, his chest heaving. He listened, straining to hear over his ragged breaths. Then it came again, the whistle, faint but unrelenting. It wasn't alone now. Two tones overlapped, harmonizing in an eerie alien cadence. Mac activated his traps, the hiss and hum of charged wires filling the air. He backed away from the door, gripping a makeshift weapon, a heavy wrench. The first creature appeared moments later. Its glossy, beetle-like shell reflected the dim light. It moved with a smooth, fluid precision, its 3 legs and 3 arms rotating as it approached, its triangular head tilted sharply to the side, black and inscrutable. The whistle it emitted seemed to resonate from deep within its chest. Mac started, his mind struggling to reconcile what he was seeing. The creature paused at the edge of his traps, studying the setup with an almost mechanical focus. Then it moved forward. The electrified wire snapped to life, arcing blue sparks. The creature seized and collapsed, its limbs twitching. Faint lines of bioluminescent blood seeped from its body, casting eerie shadows on the ground. Mac felt a grim satisfaction, but his relief was short-lived. The second alien emerged, stepping over its fallen companion. This one was different. It stopped to examine the electrified wire, tilting its head. Then, with surgical precision, it used one of its sharp, scalpel-like fingers to quickly sever the power source. Max swore as he heard much of the hum from his traps fade. He watched on a monitor as the creature rotated its limbs, then began climbing. His entire defense plans had been predicated on the assumption he would be fighting humans. Although it wasn't impossible, the likelihood that someone would try to enter from one of the metal industrial vents 20 feet up the otherwise bare concrete wall hadn't occurred to him. With the same eerie precision, the insect thing clipped through each of the metal slats of the vent, and they clattered loudly on the hard gray floor, each one counting down to the next attack. With a fluid grace, it emerged through the opening and dropped almost silently to the floor, a faint clicking as its 3 pointed legs made contact with the floor. It tilted its head again, far beyond a human's range of motion, and resumed the whistling sound. Its whistle was softer now, almost contemplative, as it slowly approached him. Mac swung his wrench, aiming for its head, but the alien deflected the blow with a swift, effortless motion. It grabbed him with 2 arms, pinning him against the wall. The whistle shifted to a lower, mournful tone as the alien tilted its head, studying him. Its 3rd arm extended, fingers branching out into delicate, feeler-like tendrils. They brushed against Mac's leg, sending a shiver down his spine. Then the scalpel finger emerged. Pain exploded through him as the alien cut into his leg with chilling precision. Blood poured from the wound, warm and sticky against his skin. Mac screamed, thrashing uselessly against the creature's grip. The whistle continued, rhythmic and calm, as if the alien was conducting a macabre experiment. His hand brushed against a live cable on the floor. It was part of a trap that hadn't been completed yet. The other end of the trap was a metal plate they were both standing on. Desperation overrode the pain. He jerked his leg away from the monster's scalpel, cutting deep curved grooves into his leg. Mac grabbed the cable and thrust it into the alien's torso. The jolt was immediate. The creature convulsed, its whistle turning into a shrill, distorted shriek. Bioluminescent blood sprayed in arcs, illuminating the room in ghastly blues and greens. The alien released him, collapsing in a twitching heap. Mac crawled away, dragging his injured leg, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He grabbed the discarded wrench, raising it high above his head. It came down in a crunch on the thing's head. He kept hitting it and didn't stop until he was sure it was dead. The safe house was silent again, but it no longer felt safe. Mac leaned against the wall, inspecting his mangled leg. The flesh was shredded, the bone visible in places. He tore a strip from his shirt and tied a tourniquet, hissing through clenched teeth. He thought he had some clotting gel in his emergency kit. He rummaged around in it until he found a foil packet and tore it open. It wouldn't be enough to stop all of the bleeding, but would keep him from bleeding out. The wounds the thing had made followed a strange pattern. Perfectly straight lines with abrupt right-angle turns. It looked something like a circuit board cut into flesh, ending with ragged slices from when he jerked his foot away. The air reeked of ozone and burnt flesh. Mac turned to the alien's body, the bioluminescent blood fading to a dull glow. He approached it cautiously, his wrench raised. Now that his wound was handled, he decided to inspect the creature further. Up close it was even more grotesque. Its hands, if they could be called that, were organic but resembled some sort of twisted Swiss Army knife. Scalpel fingers, screwdriver-like appendages, and fine branching tendrils extended from the fibrous, chitinous limbs. Mac realized these weren't tools. They were part of the creature's body. It was a scavenger like him. But it wasn't here to survive. It was here to dissect, to study, to dismantle. He slumped against the wall, his vision blurring from exhaustion and blood loss. The faint whistle returned, distant but growing louder. More were coming. Mac forced himself to his feet, grabbing what supplies he could. His home was no longer a refuge, it was a trap. He limped into the night, leaving the ruined city behind, the eerie whistle echoing in his ears. And in the distance, the orbital elevator loomed, its shadow stretching toward him like a harbinger of worse things to come. Cuts beneath the surface. The clinic was a battered remnant of hope in the shadow of the spine. It cut the sky and mirrored so many of the wounds he saw every day. The light filtering through the cracked windows was gray and faint, barely illuminating the makeshift waiting area, which was already full, even though they hadn't opened yet. Inside, the clinic reeked of antiseptic mingled with the damp metallic stench of flooding. Water pooled in corners and seeped under the door, carrying filth from the slum's alleys. It was almost impossible to keep the water out, and there just wasn't the budget for a proper fix. The generator sputtered again, causing the overhead lights to flicker. He hadn't even started working on his first patient of the day, and there were already problems. Dr. Elias Rohn sighed as he set his tools on the tray beside him, his gloves stained red with someone else's blood. Another gang fight. Another young man gutted for something as meaningless as turf. Once the lighting stabilized, he stitched the wound methodically, his fingers steady despite the noise and chaos of the cramped room. He felt the weight of his sidearm under his lab coat. He hated carrying it, but in the slums, violence was always closer than help. Outside, the streets were alive with tension. Voices rose and fell in bursts of anger and desperation. Gunfire cracked sporadically, a grim reminder of the lawless state just beyond the clinic's thin walls. Rohn's time as a soldier had taught him how to distinguish threats from the hum of background violence, but tonight the noise felt sharper, the kind of sharpness that pricked at old instincts. He'd taken the night shift because it was the most dangerous, and he had the most experience of any of the clinicians present to deal with it. Rohn wasn't a hero. He'd given up on that notion years ago. The war had taken pieces of him he couldn't name, leaving behind a man who knew how to take things apart, but found strange solace in putting them back together. His graying hair and hollowed cheeks made him look older than he was, but his eyes burned with an unrelenting focus. His tools were outdated, scavenged from military medkits and the occasional black market haul, but they worked well enough for stitching wounds, draining infections, and resetting bones. The people here didn't care about perfection. They just needed to survive another day, and he gave them that when he could. The clinic door creaked open, and a woman stepped inside, cradling a child with a fever. Roan gestured to the rickety cot against the wall. "Over there, I'll be with you in a minute," he said without looking up. He was still cleaning the blood from his gloves when he noticed the man standing in the doorway, a wiry figure clutching his thigh, his face pale and sweaty. The man's injury caught Roan's eye immediately. The wound on his leg was long and precise, the edges clean as though sliced by a scalpel. Roan frowned. This wasn't the jagged tear of a shiv or the uneven hack of a machete. It was deliberate, clinical. "What happened?" Roan asked, his voice low and even as he motioned for the man to sit. "Don't know," the man muttered, avoiding his gaze. "Woke up bleeding in an alley." "Didn't see who did it?" Roan pressed. The man shook his head. "Didn't hear or see nothing. Just woke up like this." Roan crouched by the cot, examining the wound more closely. The cut was deep but avoided any major arteries. Whoever had done this knew exactly where to strike. It wasn't an attempt to kill. It was something else entirely. The thought left a cold weight in his stomach. He stitched the wound quickly, the room silent except for the drip of water from the ceiling and the faint buzz of the generator. The man thanked him, left a handful of crumpled bills, and hobbled out. Roan watched him disappear into the night, the uneasy feeling settling deeper in his stomach. The following day was much the same. The clinic's doors opened and closed in a steady rhythm, each creak bringing another face etched with desperation and pain. Over the following days, the grim pattern continued to take shape. Patient after patient arrived with similar injuries, clean, surgical cuts that showed more precision than rage. The stories they told, or refused to tell, left an uneasy weight in the air, pressing harder with every case. A scrawny teenager sat on the edge of a cot, his legs swaddled in a blood-soaked rag. His hands trembled as he spoke, voice barely above a whisper. "There was this sound," he said, staring at the floor. "Like a whistle, soft at first, but it got louder. Thought it was someone fooling around. Then, nothing. Woke up like this." He gestured to the wound running along his calf. Roan's frown deepened. The cut was deep enough to cripple, but left tendons and arteries untouched. A calculated injury, not the chaos of a brawl. Another patient, a young woman with hollow eyes, sat hunched in the corner. She refused to meet Roan's gaze, her voice tight with fear. "I saw someone," she murmured. "He was there, then gone, like he got pulled into the shadows. Didn't see what it was. I ran." She shivered violently, hugging herself. Roan pressed for details, but she shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Don't ask me," she hissed. "I don't want to remember." The stories began to stack, their details fractured but eerily consistent. A middle-aged man described waking in an abandoned building, his legs sliced open, blood pooling around him. "Didn't hear a thing," he said, his voice brittle. "Didn't see anyone, just woke up. Thought I was dead." At first, Roan clung to the familiar. Gangs, turf wars, an escalation of violence in a slum already drowning in it. Maybe one of the factions had acquired new tech, blazers or surgical tools, and was testing it in the alleys. He voiced his suspicions to a fellow medic, a weary woman who ran a supply depot nearby. "Escalating," she scoffed, her voice heavy with cynicism. "It's the spine, Roan. Everyone's bleeding from something. Don't get philosophical about it." But the words didn't settle him. The cuts weren't random, nor were they the jagged aftermath of street fights. They were deliberate, methodical. The precision gnawed at him, pulling threads loose in his mind. Each case left his clinic colder, quieter, as though the shadows in the corners had stretched just a little further, and at night when the generator sputtered and the lights dimmed, he swore he could hear it, the faintest hint of a whistle, carried on the stale, damp air. The clinic's lights flickered once, twice, then sputtered out completely. The hum of the generator faltered and died, leaving the room in oppressive silence. Dr. Rohn cursed under his breath, fumbling for the flashlight clipped to his belt. The beam cast sharp, shifting shadows across the clinic's worn walls, illuminating rusting medical equipment and the faint sheen of water pooling in the corners. The patient on the cot groaned as Rohn threaded a needle, his hand steady despite the dim light. "Hold still," he muttered, his voice low and gravelly. The shadows danced with each movement of the flashlight, the needle's glint a stark reminder of the clinic's grim necessities. The muffled sounds of the slum filtered in through the cracked windows, distant shouting, the occasional crack of gunfire, and then something else. A faint, melodic whistle drifted on the stale air, barely audible but distinct enough to make Rohn pause. He froze, the flashlight beam shaking slightly as he turned his head toward the sound. "Just the wind," he muttered to himself, forcing his focus back to the wound. He didn't believe it, and neither did his patient, who froze at the sound then began shaking slightly. But the whistle lingered in his mind long after it faded, scratching at the edges of his thoughts. Later that night, after the clinic had emptied, Rohn sat at his desk. A stack of scribbled notes spread before him. Each patient's name, each injury, each story, he traced the lines with his finger, connecting threads that led to one unsettling conclusion. All the patients with the precise cuts came from the same area, a stretch of the slum near the spine's maintenance tunnels. The tunnels were a forgotten vein of the city, prone to flooding and shrouded in darkness. Authorities rarely ventured there, and the gangs avoided it except for the most desperate pursuits. It was a place where the shadows seemed to stretch longer, where whispers carried further. Rohn leaned back, rubbing his temples. His instincts, honed in battlefields far from here, screamed at him to take the pattern seriously. He began asking questions again, subtle at first. Some patients stiffened, their eyes darting toward the windows as if afraid of being overheard. "Don't go there," one man muttered, clutching his freshly bandaged leg. "There's things in the dark." "What things?" Rohn pressed, but the man only shook his head, his lips tight. A woman spat on the clinic floor when he mentioned the tunnels. "You don't want to know," she said, her voice trembling. "Just leave it alone." Alone in the clinic, Rohn paced the room, his boots splashing through the shallow water on the floor. The whistle he'd heard earlier replayed in his mind, intertwining with the cryptic warnings and the unnervingly precise wounds he'd seen. His thoughts spiraled, tangling with memories of his time as a soldier. He'd seen strange things in war, bodies disassembled with surgical precision, traps set with an intelligence that defied the chaos of battle. Those memories stirred now, rising like ghosts to haunt his waking hours. Was he overthinking it? Was this just another thread of violence in a city fraying at the edges? And that was so long ago. Rohn leaned against the counter, staring at his trembling hands. The scars from old battles itched beneath his gloves. He was no stranger to fear, but this felt different. This wasn't the roar of combat or the clash of soldiers. It was something quieter, insidious, a creeping sense of being watched by something unseen, something that waited patiently in the dark. The clinic door slammed open, the harsh sound slicing through the muffled hum of the struggling generator. Rohn instinctively reached for his sidearm, his heartbeat quickening. But the figure that staggered in wasn't a threat, at least not an immediate one. The man was wiry, his gaunt frame barely supporting his weight as he stumbled forward, clutching at a makeshift bandage wrapped around his legs. His clothes were torn, soaked with grime and streaked with something that shimmered faintly, an unsettling faint green glow that painted his pale face in sickly hues. Rohn caught him before he collapsed, his grip firm despite the man's weight. "Easy," the doctor muttered, dragging him toward the nearest cot. "Sit, don't move." The man's eyes darted wildly, his breath shallow and erratic. there in the tunnels," he stammered, his voice hoarse and cracking. Bigger than anything should be." Rowan knelt, pulling back the sodden bandage with a practiced hand. His stomach churned. The wounds were brutal, long, surgical cuts that traced the contours of the man's legs. These were far deeper than the injuries he'd treated before, the flesh almost dissected. "What did this to you?" Rone asked, his tone sharper than intended. He didn't expect an answer. Too many of his patients had been too shaken or evasive. But this one was different. The man, Mac as he later introduced himself, looked up, his eyes bloodshot and wide. "The tunnels," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "I was in the tunnels, just looking for wire and such. I've done it 100 times, easy scrap. But this time, saw some things. Wire cut too clean. Though it might be someone with serious connections to get the tools to do that, so I had to go deeper in," and he trailed off, his face twisting in horror. As Dr. Roan cleaned the wounds, Mac began to speak, his words tumbling out in a panicked rush. "I found this patch," he said, staring at the ceiling as though reliving the moment. "A gold mine of wire and capacitors just hanging there. But something was off. I heard this whistling, like wind or pipes. But I was too far underground for that." Roan worked silently, his hands steady as his mind raced. He'd heard a whistling too. "Then I heard it again," Mac continued, his voice trembling. "That whistle. Again. I thought it was the pipes, but it wasn't just noise. It moved like it was alive. And then I saw them." Mac's breathing hitched. "Big, black, oily looking. Their legs, they were like blades, sharp as knives. They moved too fast, too smooth, like machines, but worse. They cut through wire, walls, everything. They saw me, and I ran." His words broke off into a shaky laugh. "I don't even know how I got out. I heard them behind me, made it back to my house, thought I was dead." Roan didn't speak immediately, focusing on stitching the gashes in Mac's legs. But his hands felt heavier with every movement. The pieces clicked into place, each one locking with a weight that pressed on his chest. The precise cuts, the glowing residue, the whistling, everything he'd tried to rationalize over the past weeks now stared him in the face. This wasn't gang violence. It wasn't new weapons or strange tools. It was something else. Something alive. "Those things," Roan said finally, his voice low, "they've been out there for a while." Mac nodded weakly, his eyes glazed. "They're still there, in the tunnels, waiting." The generator flickered again, plunging the room into darkness for a heartbeat. In the distance, faint but audible, a whistling sound rose on the damp air. Roan froze, his hand instinctively moving toward his sidearm. Mac's eyes widened in terror. "They found us," Mac whispered. The clinic's lights gave a final, pitiful flicker before the generator sputtered and fell silent. Darkness consumed the room, oppressive and absolute, broken only by the faint, sickly glow of the bioluminescent residue streaked across Mac's torn clothes. The dim light threw jagged shadows onto the damp walls, twisting and stretching with every movement. Dr. Roan stood motionless, his breath shallow, listening. The clinic, usually alive with distant noise from the streets outside, had fallen into an eerie, suffocating silence. Then it came again. That faint whistle, distant and melodic, drifting through the cracked windows and waterlogged corridors. Mac stirred, his voice trembling. "The generator, I can fix it. We need power back now." Roan hesitated. Every rational thought screamed to stay put, to let the darkness conceal them, but the thought of facing whatever was out there without power was worse. He grabbed his flashlight and nodded. "Let's move." They descended into the basement, the flashlight beam slicing through the black. The air grew colder, heavier, carrying the sharp tang of metal and mildew. The flooded floor was slick, and they had to proceed to the basement slower than either of them would have liked. "Let's see what happened," Mac muttered, kneeling by the generator. His hands shook as he inspected the wires, the glow from his clothes casting an unnatural light over the machinery. Something's cut the cables. Clean? Too clean. Roan's pulse quickened, his eyes scanning the basement. The shadows seemed to move unnaturally, flickering along the walls like something alive. The whistling grew louder, clearer. It wasn't random. It carried an eerie, deliberate cadence, rising and falling in chilling harmony. Mac worked faster, his breath ragged. Come on, come on! The water rippled. Roan froze. His flashlight beam darted across the room, landing on the far wall. Something moved. A shape, glossy and black, shifted just out of the light's reach. A soft clicking sound joined the whistling, rhythmic and mechanical. Then it stepped forward. The insect was massive, some 8 feet tall, its glossy shell reflecting the faint bioluminescence of Mac's residue-streaked clothes and the flashlight. Its triangular head tilted, and it paused, as though studying them. Scalpel-like limbs unfolded with an organic, sickening precision, clicking faintly as they scraped against each other. Roan's heart thundered as he raised his sidearm, his finger hovering over the trigger. Behind him, Mac whispered, "Oh no, oh no." More shapes emerged from the shadows, their movements unnervingly fluid. Each one seemed to move in perfect coordination, their limbs cutting precise paths through the water. The whistling shifted, becoming more chaotic, a rising cacophony that filled the air like a living entity. "Run," Roan said, his voice cold and steady despite the fear coursing through him. He stepped backward, his flashlight shaking slightly as the creatures closed in. The largest insect lunged first, its scalpel limbs slicing through the air with terrifying precision. Roan fired, the gunshot deafening in the confined space. The creature jerked back, glowing fluid spraying across the walls, but another stepped forward to replace it. "We need to move," Mac shouted. The whistling grew deafening, drowning out all thought. The doctor's grip on his sidearm tightened as he and Mac turned and ran, the sound of clicking limbs chasing them through the flooded corridors. The basement became a blur of shadow and chaos as they fled upstairs. The clinic's narrow corridors became a labyrinth of chaos as Dr. Roan and Mac sprinted through the ankle-deep water. The beam from Roan's flashlight wavered wildly, casting fleeting glimpses of glossy black carapaces and scalpel-like limbs slicing through the air. Behind them, the whistling rose to a maddening crescendo, the sound vibrating through the walls and digging into their skulls like nails. "This way," Roan barked, skidding around a corner and shoving open a supply room door. It was just a section of hallway they'd added doors to in an effort to prevent the theft of their rarer items. Mac followed, his face pale and slick with sweat. The doctor slammed the door behind them, leaning against it for a moment to catch his breath. The reprieve was short-lived. The sound of claws raking against metal grew closer, punctuated by the occasional crash as something heavy tore through the clinic's fragile walls. "They're tearing the place apart," Mac whispered, clutching his side. "Stay quiet," Roan muttered, his voice barely audible over the pounding in his ears. His mind raced as he mapped out their escape. The creatures were faster, but their precision worked against them. They moved with an unsettling efficiency, but that meant they followed predictable paths. If they could outmaneuver them... The door buckled under a sudden impact, the hinges shrieking. Roan yanked Mac forward. "Move!" He threw the back door open and ran. Mac hobbled behind him. The duo sprinted again, navigating the clinic's twisting halls. Mac tripped, splashing into the water, but Roan hauled him to his feet without stopping. Behind them, the whistling closed in, their scalpel limbs slicing clean through walls and doors. They burst through the clinic's rear exit into the damp, garbage-strewn alleys of the slums. The rain-soaked streets were silent save for their ragged breaths. Roan turned, sidearm raised, but the creatures stopped just inside the clinic's shadowed doorway. The whistling softened, retreating into the clinic as if the creatures were bound to their underground lair. Mac leaned against a wall, his legs trembling. "They're not done," he said, his voice a broken whisper. "They're just waiting." Roan followed Mac's gaze toward the spine. The massive structure loomed above them, its base disappearing into the clouds like a monolith of steel and silence. The realization hit him like a blow. This was only the beginning. The creatures weren't retreating. They were regrouping. We need to warn them. I have some connections. Let's go, Roan said, his voice grim and steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. He tightened his grip on his sidearm and stared into the endless shadows. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. They ran towards the spine. He hoped they'd make it. Dining in. The remains of tall buildings disappeared into the thick, ash-gray clouds above. Their jagged edges and fraying cables swayed faintly in the wind, casting long, ominous shadows over the sprawling urban decay below. The city that had once thrived in the shadow of these great buildings had rotted away, its towers crumbling, its streets choked with rubble and overgrowth. Electric signs flickered weakly, their colors bleeding into the ever-present haze of smog. Amid this desolation sat the diner, a greasy, run-down holdout in a particularly forgotten corner of the city. Its faded sign barely clung to its rusted frame, its neon lighting buzzing faintly, casting a vibrant pink glow over the warped pavement outside. The windows were boarded up, but cracks in the wood allowed slivers of light to leak out, giving the impression of life inside. The smell of stale grease and burnt coffee clung to the walls, saturating the air so thoroughly that even fresh food smelled faintly fried. Inside, the atmosphere was no better. The worn linoleum floors were stained with decades of spills, and the mismatched tables wobbled on uneven legs. The patrons, if one could call them that, were a mix of scavengers, drifters, and the occasional ganger looking to avoid attention. Their voices carried over the hum of a dying jukebox in the corner, a patchwork of conversations that always circled back to the same topic: the disappearances. "Another one missing," muttered a man at the counter, his voice low as if the walls themselves might be listening. "2 blocks from here, just gone. No sign of a struggle." "Gangs, probably," another chimed in, stirring a watery cup of coffee. "Territory grabs, or those corpos clearing us out for some shiny new project." The waitress moved between tables, her expression a mask of indifference. She'd heard it all before. Every shift brought fresh rumors. People vanishing without a trace, strange lights in the sky, shadowy figures spotted in the ruins. Everyone had a theory, and none of them mattered. She wasn't interested in paranoia. She just wanted to get through her shift, collect her meager pay, and go home. The waitress, in her stained apron and scuffed shoes, was a fixture of the diner as much as the warped counter and ancient coffee pot. She was young but looked older, her features etched with the exhaustion of long shifts and hard living. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and her hands were rough from years of scrubbing grease and clearing tables. She had learned early on to tune out the noise, the stories, the fears, the chaos of the spine. It was easier to survive that way. Her world was confined to the clatter of dishes, the shuffle of feet, and the steady rhythm of routine. As long as she kept her head down, the dangers of the city would pass her by. Or so she told herself. Tonight was no different. The diner buzzed with muted conversation, and she moved through it like a ghost, her presence barely acknowledged by the handful of patrons hunched over their meals. She set down plates, refilled cups, and avoided the occasional leering gaze with practiced ease. But as the evening wore on, the flickering lights above seemed dimmer than usual, and the conversations grew quieter. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it a strange stillness that made her pause as she wiped down a table. For the first time in a long while, she felt something unfamiliar, a prickle of unease. She shook it off, retreating behind the counter to stack plates and ready herself for the next order. The city had always been a mess, and the spine had always cast long shadows. Nothing ever truly changed, or so she thought. The usual hum of quiet conversation was muffled, almost distant, like it was happening in a dream. Only a handful of regulars sat scattered across the cracked vinyl booths, their voices low and strained as they traded stories of the latest disappearances. The waitress moved through the space mechanically, the tray balanced on her hand like an extension of herself, her ears catching fragments of their murmurs. Not one Ghana right near the old subway station. No bodies, nothing, just vanished. Some have strange cuts, if they ever do find anything. Even the jukebox had stopped working, its usual soft hum replaced by an oppressive silence. As she punched in an order, she noticed something. The faint clatter of pots and pans from the kitchen had gone quiet. Her stomach tightened. She called out, her voice trembling slightly. "Where's my food for table 3? Nothing. No shout from the cooks, no familiar grumble about late orders. Her fingers hesitated, then pushed the swinging door open. "Hey, you guys!" The words died in her throat. The kitchen was empty. Steam hissed weakly from an unattended pot on the stove, and half-prepped plates sat abandoned on the counter. Knives were still embedded in chopping boards, and half-sliced onion lay discarded on the floor, its pungent aroma mingling with the acrid scent of grease. It was as if they'd been ripped out of existence mid-motion. Her heart pounded as she backed toward the door, her pulse loud in her ears. Something wasn't right. Something was very wrong. The sound came softly at first, so faint she thought it was in her head. A single melodic whistle, high and sweet like a child playing a tune. She froze, her hand on the edge of the counter, her breath hitching as the sound grew louder, echoing through the empty diner. It wasn't random, it was deliberate, almost alive. Her eyes flicked toward the boarded-up tunnel entrance at the far end of the diner, the boards trembling as if something massive moved behind them. The whistle rose, weaving into an eerie symphony of dissonant tones, and the boards splintered with a deafening crack. They came through the opening like liquid shadows, their glossy black shells glinting faintly in the dim light of the flickering neon signs. Each creature was insect-like, its limbs long and jointed, fingers with razor-sharp edges. Their heads were triangular, faceted with glimmering black eyes that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. They moved with haunting precision, their many-fingered hands clicking softly against the wall and tables. They spread through the diner, their movements synchronized and deliberate. The patrons didn't even have time to scream before they were attacked. One of the creatures lashed out, its scalpel limbs grabbing a man by his feet, his body crumpling without resistance. Another pinned a woman to the floor, its fingers slicing into her flesh with surgical efficiency. Blood oozed across the cracked linoleum. The waitress dove behind the counter, her knees hitting the floor hard as she pressed herself into the smallest space she could find. Her breathing was shallow, her chest tight as she clutched her hands over her mouth to stifle any sound. They began to search, their movements methodical. She could hear the scalpel limbs clicking against the floor, the soft, melodic whistling growing louder as if they were speaking to each other. Dishes shattered, wood splintered, and the faint pop of breaking glass punctuated the chaos. She bit her lip until she tasted blood, her eyes squeezed shut as the sound of one creature grew closer. Its whistle rose to a high-pitched crescendo, and she felt its presence just on the other side of the counter. They didn't find her, but the ones they did find took a long, long time to die. She heard the things all night. The dawn brought no warmth, only cold light seeping through the jagged holes in the diner's boarded windows. The waitress emerged slowly from her hiding place, her legs trembling so violently she could barely stand. Her eyes darted around the wreckage, taking in the destruction with a detached numbness. In the morning, the diner was unrecognizable. Tables were overturned, their surfaces gouged with deep, precise cuts. Blood pooled on the floor, mixing with shattered glass and splintered wood. The boarded-up tunnel was now fully exposed, the dark entrance gaping like a screaming mouth. The faint smell of some residue she didn't recognize lingered in the air, mixing with the coppery tang of blood. She stepped over the wreckage, her movements stiff, her mind struggling to process what she'd seen. It didn't feel real. None of it did. A voice broke through the silence. "Hey, over here!" She turned slowly to see a group of scavengers entering the ruins, their faces wary as they took in the scene. One of them, a man with a scarred cheek, stepped closer. "You okay? What happened here?" The waitress didn't answer. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. She dropped to her knees, her gaze fixed on the tunnel entrance as if expecting the creatures to emerge again. The scavengers exchanged uneasy glances. One knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Come on, let's get you out of here." She didn't resist as they lifted her to her feet, her body limp and unresponsive. As they carried her away, she whispered one word, her voice barely audible. "Whistling." The clinic stood in the shadow of the spine, a grim block of rusted metal and salvaged parts barely holding together. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of antiseptic and sweat, the dim light of flickering fluorescent tubes casting sharp, uneven shadows across the cramped space. Dr. Roan, a grizzled man with sunken eyes and a perpetual frown, worked methodically, his hands steady despite the clear strain etched into his face. The scavengers eased the waitress onto a creaking examination table. She was still, her body stiff as if she were bracing against some unseen threat. Her wide, hollow eyes stared at nothing, her lips occasionally moving in near-silent murmurs. "She hasn't said much," one scavenger muttered, shifting uncomfortably. "Just keeps whispering about something in the tunnel." Roan nodded, waving them away. "Thanks, I'll take it from here." His voice was gruff, but there was a faint thread of unease beneath it. He leaned in, shining a flickering penlight across her eyes. "Can you hear me?" he asked gently. "What happened?" The waitress flinched at the sound of his voice, her gaze snapping toward him. "The whistling," she muttered, her voice barely a whisper. They didn't stop. Shadows with blades. They're still there." Roan's jaw tightened as he straightened. He scribbled notes on a crumpled pad, his brow furrowed. "Shadows with blades," he murmured to himself. He stepped away, casting a glance at the scavengers waiting by the door. "I've heard this before," he said quietly. "Other survivors, they all talk about the same thing. Whistling, blades, something hunting in the ruins. But it's never been this close." One scavenger stiffened. "You think it's spreading?" Roan didn't answer. He only glanced back at the waitress, who now rocked slightly on the table, her gaze fixed on the dark corner of the clinic. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant sound of the generator. Dr. Roan sat at his desk, the waitress's fragmented words scrawled across the notepad in front of him. "Whistling, shadows, blades," he muttered, reading the phrases over and over. "Stayed so long, dining in." Outside, the city was a hushed void, the ruins of the spine looming like a grave marker. Roan's pen paused mid-stroke as a sound reached his ears. A faint, lilting whistle. It was soft, barely there, but unmistakable. His heart stilled. He froze, straining to listen. The sound lingered, weaving a haunting melody, before fading into the distant night. Roan exhaled sharply, his fingers trembling as he set the pen down. "It's just the wind," he told himself, though the words rang hollow. Across the room, the waitress sat in the corner, her knees pulled to her chest. She rocked back and forth, her eyes locked on the clinic door. "They'll come," she whispered, barely audible. "When it's dark, they'll come." The fluorescent light flickered overhead, casting shifting shadows on the walls. In the silence, Roan thought he heard it again, a faint whistle, floating on the wind. Down the drain. Ethan Sykes pulled his coat tighter against the damp chill as he surveyed the access point to the vertical shaft. The underbelly of the city stretched around him like a forgotten maze, a vast and sprawling warren of corroded metal and twisted pipes. Water dripped from every joint, pooling in oily puddles on the grated floors. Above him, the orbital freight catapult's faint hum resonated through the structure, a constant reminder of the high-stakes system they were here to stabilize. Without the electromagnets working properly, the spine's delicate operations would grind to a halt, threatening everything it supported. The latest coolant fluctuations had triggered alarms back at corporate HQ. For the people running the show, it was numbers on a screen. For Ethan and his crew, it was the difference between a functional system and catastrophic failure. He ran a hand through his graying hair and exhaled a sharp breath, his eyes squinting at the narrow shaft ahead. "All right, lads," Ethan said, his voice carrying the kind of gruff authority earned through years of thankless work. "Let's make this quick. Catapult can't keep cool without this fix, and I'm not keen on fried circuits. Or fried plumbers." The crew chuckled nervously, though the tension was palpable. The diagnostic drone they'd sent ahead hadn't made it far. Its signal had gone dark just beyond the first bend, leaving only garbled static on their monitors. That left the job to human hands. And when the location of the leak was pinpointed, deep in a confined vertical shaft where most wouldn't fit, Ethan had stepped up. Compact, wiry, and seasoned in tight spaces, he knew there was no one else better suited for the task. Or at least that's what he told himself. The crew worked around him, attaching the harness to the industrial winch as the whine of its motor echoed through the cavernous tunnels. Ethan methodically adjusted his gear, testing the weight of the toolkit strapped to his hip. It felt heavier than usual, though he chalked it up to the tension twisting in his gut. He tightened the straps of his harness, ensuring it wouldn't budge under strain, then grabbed his helmet and switched on the mounted light. "Sure about this, Sykes?" one of his crew asked. The younger man's voice wavered slightly, betraying the unease everyone was trying to hide. Ethan nodded, forcing a wry grin. "Better me than you lot. Besides, I don't trust anyone else to get it done right." He stepped toward the edge of the shaft and peered into the abyss. The metal walls were slick with condensation, the result of coolant spraying from some unseen rupture far below. Frost clung to the edges, glistening in the beam of his helmet light. The distant hum of the catapult vibrated through the structure, its rhythmic pulse both reassuring and ominous. "Lower me slow," Ethan ordered, his voice firm. "Don't rush it." The winch groaned to life, and Ethan felt the harness tighten around his chest as he began his descent. The air grew colder the further down he went, the walls narrowing and glistening with moisture. His helmet light cut through the swirling mist, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to dance on the walls. Every creak of the winch and hiss of leaking coolant amplified the stillness around him, making the space feel even more claustrophobic. The shaft was a tunnel of grime and decay, its decades of neglect evident in every rusted rivet and discolored surface. His sensor pad flickered as faint anomalies registered in the periphery. Erratic heat signatures that flared for a second before vanishing. "Bloody interference," Ethan muttered under his breath. The anomalies didn't make sense this far down. The coolant should have drowned out any erratic thermal readings, but he had bigger things to worry about. He focused on steadying his breathing, the rhythmic hum of the winch and the occasional hiss of leaking pipes becoming his only companions. Halfway down, he signaled the crew to pause, raising a gloved hand. Something had caught his eye. He adjusted the beam of his helmet light, sweeping it over the walls. Deep, clean grooves lined the metal, their edges unnaturally smooth. Ethan frowned, leaning closer. These weren't cracks from wear and tear, nor were they caused by coolant bursts. "These aren't from coolant bursts," he whispered into the comm. Static crackled in response, but no voice came through. He glanced upward, his light tracing the now distant lip of the shaft. The crew was out of sight, their voices silent. The faint hum of the catapult felt like it was growing louder, resonating deep in his chest. A shiver ran down his spine, but he pushed the unease aside. "Get it together, Sykes," he muttered to himself. Gripping the winch cable tighter, he gestured for the crew to resume lowering him. The winch creaked, and the descent continued. The winch jolted suddenly, throwing Ethan against the cold, slick wall of the shaft. His gloved hands tightened around the cable, the harness digging painfully into his chest. "What's going on up there?" he barked into the comm, his voice echoing up the confined space. Static hissed in response. No reassuring voices, no instructions, just silence. The cable jerked again, harder this time, throwing him downward in a violent lurch. His stomach dropped, the winch groaning like a dying animal. Ethan craned his neck, squinting up the shaft, but his helmet light couldn't penetrate the gloom. Then, without warning, a sharp metallic ping echoed through the tunnel, followed by an unnatural stillness. The cable snapped. For one horrifying moment, Ethan hung suspended, weightless in the dark, his breath caught in his throat. Then gravity claimed him, and the shaft blurred around him as he plummeted. His helmet light flickered madly, the beams illuminating jagged metal edges and spiraling shadows. He flung out his arms, trying to grab onto anything in the dark. His hands clung to pipes and wires, but he couldn't maintain his hold. Ethan's body tensed instinctively, bracing for impact. He slammed into a metal platform with a bone-rattling thud, the impact driving the air from his lungs. Pain erupted in his ribs as he rolled to a stop, his helmet skidding off to one side. For a moment the world was a spinning blur of agony and flashing red indicators from his datapad. He gasped for breath, each inhale sharp and shallow. His ribs protested with every movement as he gingerly propped himself up. He groaned, clutching his side. His datapad flickered, the diagnostic showing a litany of system errors. Communications, offline. Location sensors, offline. Safety link, offline. He was cut off, completely alone. Ethan forced himself to sit up, his hands trembling as he reached for his scattered toolkit. Tools glinted faintly under the stuttering light from his helmet, which lay tilted against a nearby railing. He scooped them up, pausing to steady his breath. Above him the shaft stretched into an infinite black void. No sound came from above. No shouts, no attempts at rescue, just silence. The platform beneath him groaned ominously, swaying slightly with the structure's distant vibrations. It jutted out into an unfamiliar maintenance corridor, its edges jagged and rusted. The air was dense and acrid, a tang of burning metal and something he couldn't quite place, a bitter chemical scent that made his nose sting. With no other choice, Ethan pocketed his tools and limped forward. Each step sent sharp twinges through his ribs, but he pressed on, one hand braced against the wall for support. The hum of electromagnetics vibrated faintly through the metal, a steady undercurrent that seemed to grow louder with every step. The corridor opened abruptly into a cavernous chamber and Ethan froze, his helmet light sweeping over the space. The walls rose impossibly high, lined with colossal electromagnetic coils that pulsed faintly with weak energy. Their usual blue glow was tainted green by the coolant leaking from ruptured pipes, dripping steadily into wide pools below. The liquid shimmered with an otherworldly radiance, casting eerie reflections that danced across the chamber. Shadows flickered erratically, warping with each weak spark that sputtered from the coils. The hum was louder here, resonating deep in Ethan's chest. He hesitated at the threshold. "Focus," he muttered to himself, clutching his toolkit tightly. His boots splashed through a shallow puddle as he stepped into the chamber, the coolant chilling him through the soles of his shoes. He moved cautiously, his eyes darting to every shifting shadow. The walls bore strange marks, deep, precise grooves that ran along the metal with an unnatural symmetry. Lines running parallel like a circuit diagram. Ethan stopped to inspect one, running his fingers over the edges. His heart pounded as his mind raced through possibilities, none of them comforting. A sudden hiss made him spin, his helmet light cutting through the dark. One of the pools bubbled slightly, the liquid rippling outward as if something had disturbed it. Ethan froze, every muscle tensed, his breath shallow. The whistling started faintly then, a soft, musical sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It reverberated through the chamber, weaving itself into the hum of the coils. At first he thought it was the machinery, but as the sound grew louder, it became clear. This was something alive. He tightened his grip on his wrench, his knuckles white. the green glow reflected off the coolant pools, painting the chamber in sickly light as the whistling shifted in tone, carrying a deliberate, almost curious rhythm. Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears. He wasn't alone down here. His stomach churned as the shadow shifted. It was like nothing he had ever seen before. An insectoid nightmare, its glossy black exoskeletons shimmering with a wet, liquid sheen. The sharp angles of its triangular head gave it an alien cruelty, and its scalpel-like limbs crackled faintly with bursts of bioelectric energy sparking in the dim light. The creature moved unnervingly slowly, deliberate in each motion, as if it was entirely unconcerned with him, at first. Its head tilted slightly, the reflective black surface showing rows of eyes, the glint of the light refracting like glass. Ethan's fingers tightened on the wrench in his hand, his chest constricting as his breath quickened. He crouched low, willing himself to stay as still as possible. Then another emerged. He'd heard rumors of things in the dark, but he just chalked it up to urban myths started by the people living on the city's edge. Whistlers is what they'd called them. The faint whistling, melodic and surreal, grew louder. More whistlers crept from the edges of the chamber, their limbs clicking softly against the metal grating. Their movements were unnervingly coordinated, as if choreographed. Ethan's heart pounded like a drum in his chest as he counted them. 3, 4, 5. Each moved with a surgeon's grace. Sparks flew as they worked, illuminating the cavern with erratic flashes of white and green. But then one stopped. It stilled, mid-motion, its triangular head snapping sharply in Ethan's direction. The whistling shifted in tone, losing its hypnotic melody and taking on a sharper, more discordant pitch. The other creatures froze too, their heads turning one by one, until every faceless gaze was locked on him. "Oh, no," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. The lead whistler lunged. Ethan reacted instinctively, throwing himself backward as the creature's limbs slashed through the air where he had been standing a moment before. The sound was sharp and clean, like a blade cutting through fabric. He hit the ground hard, his wrench skittering away across the slick surface, his ribs erupting with pain. Panic surged through him as the creature's whistling became a high-pitched wail. He scrambled to his feet and bolted, his boots slipping against the coolant-slicked floor as he ran toward the nearest corridor. The sound of clicking limbs followed close behind. The whistlers were coming after him. Each step they took seemed deliberate, as though they weren't chasing him but hurting him. Ethan ducked under a low-hanging pipe, the sharp edge of its corroded metal scraping his shoulder. He vaulted over a collapsed section of the floor. Behind him the whistlers were relentless, their glossy carapaces glinting in the faint light of his helmet beam as they pursued him through the maze-like chamber. A burst of sparks lit up the tunnel as one of the creatures slashed through a coolant pipe. A spray of freezing mist filled the air, obscuring Ethan's vision for a moment. He coughed and stumbled, the icy vapor biting at his exposed skin. But he pushed forward, his instincts screaming at him to keep running. The tunnel narrowed, forcing Ethan to squeeze through a tight vent. He twisted his body sideways, the rough edges of the metal scraping against his suit as he clawed his way through. His helmet light flickered, catching a fleeting glimpse of a whistler's limb. Ethan dropped out of the vent into another corridor, his knees buckling as he hit the floor, and there was a piercing pain in his injured side. The momentary silence felt deafening, but he knew it wouldn't last. He glanced back at the vent just in time to see the first whistler emerge. "Move, move, move," he shouted to himself, forcing his aching body into motion. He sprinted down the corridor, his legs already aching. The sound of the whistlers grew louder, their relentless pursuit driving him forward. He knew he couldn't outrun them forever. His mind raced, searching for a plan, for anything that could buy him more time. The only thing louder than the whistlers was the pounding of his own heart. Cornered near some massive coils, Ethan's breath came in sharp gasps, his mind racing as the whistlers advanced. Their hard-shelled limbs clicked against the metal floor, echoing like the ticking of some inescapable clock. Their heads tilted in unison, observing him with an intelligence that made his blood run cold. The melodic whistling had shifted into something more aggressive, each note reverberating like a death knell. Every option felt impossible, every escape route blocked. Then his eyes landed on a bank of emergency release levers. An idea struck, dangerous and desperate, but it was all he had. He threw them all open. This whole section would be underwater in moments. Ethan bolted, his boots splashing through ankle-deep water that was rising far too fast. The whistling behind him grew faint, but he didn't trust it. The freezing cold climbed to his knees, its icy touch numbing his legs as he waded through the maze of tunnels. That water was so cold. A deafening crash echoed behind him as part of the ceiling gave way, sending a deluge of water surging forward. Ethan gritted his teeth and pushed harder, forcing his body to move faster. The tunnels had become a labyrinthine nightmare, every corridor a potential dead end, every turn a gamble. The water reached his waist. It surged around him, carrying debris, chunks of metal, shattered tools, and glowing remnants of coolant. Ethan clawed his way upward, hauling himself onto a ledge as the current threatened to drag him under. The whistlers were no longer visible, but he could hear their faint, persistent whistling somewhere in the distance. He couldn't tell if it was coming closer or if his own mind was playing tricks on him. Ahead, a ventilation shaft offered a slim chance at escape. Ethan scrambled toward it, his hands slipping on the wet metal as he tried to climb. The water reached up to the ledge now, cold and relentless. His muscles ached with every movement, but adrenaline kept him going. The shaft was narrow, barely wide enough for his shoulders, but it was his only option. He pulled himself into it, gasping as the water surged beneath him. The sound of rushing liquid filled the space, deafening and oppressive. He crawled upward, his fingers scraping against the rusted walls, his breath coming in desperate gasps. Behind him, the faint whistling grew louder. The creatures were following. The shaft shuddered as something struck its base, and Ethan's heart sank. He climbed faster, his hands slick with coolant and sweat, his legs trembling with exhaustion. The air in the shaft grew thinner, every breath a struggle, but he didn't stop. A sudden burst of water shot up the shaft, nearly knocking him loose. He braced himself against the walls, coughing as the spray hit his face. The whistling was closer now, more urgent, as if the creatures knew they were losing him. Ethan forced himself to climb higher, ignoring the burning in his arms and the searing cold of the metal and freezing water against his skin. Finally, he reached the top of the shaft. A grated hatch barred his exit, its rusted bolts barely holding it in place. He slammed his shoulder against it once, twice, until it gave way. Ethan tumbled onto a dry platform, the air cold but blessedly free of the oppressive wetness below. He lay there for a moment, gasping, the faint whistling fading into the distance. For now, though, he was alive, and that was enough. Exhausted and drenched, Ethan emerged into the main shaft only to find the winch disassembled. Tools and cables lay strewn across the floor, but no sign of his team. At first he thought they were cowards who'd abandoned him, but on second thought he was sure he would have done the same thing. He began the arduous climb back to the surface, each rung of the ladder a battle against gravity and fatigue. When he finally stumbled into the control room, no one was there. Was he the only one to make it back? He collapsed into a chair, knowing he was all alone. He sat for a long time, the cold and pain replaced by grief.
Enjoy this story? Subscribe to free science fiction stories for daily sci-fi adventures.